After some contentious backroom debate, G20 leaders agreed they must prevent another financial crisis. They're divided over how to do it. This weekend summit focused on narrowing the gap between advanced and emerging economies. A lot of talk about China, looking at exchange rates. John Lipsky, the first deputy managing director of the IMF, is fresh off the plane from this meeting. He joins us now. John, the IMF is essentially tasked with enforcing this statement that took a lot of wrangling to come to. How do you do that, and how do you do that keeping China in the fold?
No, we're not enforcers. We're supporting the group of 20 economies in their process. They call it the mutual assessment process in support of strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. At the Seoul summit, the G20 leaders agreed that their deputies, their ministers, would agree on a set of indicative guidelines. In Paris, the G20 ministers agreed on a set of indicators that will be used to then set the guidelines, and those will form the basis for the assessment of each country's or each economy's policies as part of this mutual assessment effort to improve global prospects.
John, you mentioned the fact that there is an agreement on what these indicative guidelines are supposed to be, call it a yardstick, but there is no measurement. Somebody needs to be able to wield a stick here instead of a wet noodle. How do you get everybody in line when nobody can agree on the targets?
Well, there is agreement on the broad goals. There was agreement not on the guidelines, but the indicators. The guidelines will be added at the next meeting, and then that will form the basis for, first, the IMF, which has been requested by the G20 to conduct an independent assessment of the fiscal, monetary, exchange rate, and structural policies of each of the G20 economies, and that will feed into their own deliberations under the mutual assessment process. When you say somebody needs to enforce it, they need to reach the decision collectively, but they agree on the broad goals. They've agreed repeatedly that a collaborative approach to policymaking will produce an outcome better for everyone. And no one has backed away from that important insight.
Okay, but you know what the skeptics would say. The EU agreed on broad goals as well, and you had all kinds of countries violating the terms of EU membership. How are we supposed to believe that the members of the G20 are going to do the same thing, aren't going to do the same thing?
Well, it's a perfectly reasonable question, and it remains to be seen whether they will deliver. But by setting these indicative guidelines to form a basis for their own mutual assessment, by asking the IMF along with other international institutions to conduct independent assessments of their policies, they will have all the elements before them for meaningful discussion and decisions.
John, let me ask you, we've obviously seen this big run-up in oil prices, not just in Brent, but in NYMEX crude as well. How much of a risk to the global recovery could we see from oil?
Well, for sure. Part of the inching up of oil prices from the fall, or in fact over the past year, reflected greater confidence in the global expansion. The latest upward spike in prices has reflected more than anything uncertainty about future supplies, I would imagine. So if this proves to be temporary, the fears of disruption prove to be temporary, the markets are amply supplied, as your previous guest discussed. And it's unlikely it would make a substantial change in the global economic outlook. Our own forecast was already based on an assumption of about $95 a barrel for 2011. More than that, and substantially more than that, for these kinds of reasons, fears of disruption would be very difficult in many dimensions.
John, has the IMF been involved in any discussions thus far concerning Libya, and would you support a renewal of sanctions against the country given what we've seen this past weekend?
Oh, we're certainly not a political organization. We're an economic and financial technical organization. Obviously, all of us regret the violence and loss of life, and hope sincerely that the violence will cease immediately. But Libya is a member of the IMF, and we have normal relations with the authorities. Of course, the situation now is very uncertain, but we hope that things will settle down, that there will be an acceptable outcome, and that we'll resume perfectly normal relations with Libya.
All right, John, thank you very much.